Wait, go.
Good evening, and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. I hope everyone is staying safe and wearing masks and reading many biographies. I'm sorry, can people hear me? I no longer hear.
Yes, you're audible, Kai.
Yes? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Anyway, my name is Kai Bird, and I'm the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. Please note that our next event is on November 19th at 6 p.m. with David Levering Lewis, interrogating Professor Peniel Joseph about his dual biography of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. But tonight we are here to celebrate Justin Gifford for his splendid and highly colorful biography, Revolution or Death, The Life of Eldridge Cleaver, just published by Lawrence Hill Books. And here's an early copy of the book. Former Leon Levy Fellow Justin Gifford is an associate professor of English literature at the University of Nevada in Reno, and author of Pimping Fictions, African American Crime Literature and the Untold Story of Black Pulp Publishing and Street Poison, the biography of Iceberg Slim. Justin will be in conversation with Robyn Spencer, an associate professor at CUNY's Lehman College, and the author of The Revolution Has Come, Black Power, Gender, and the Black Panther Party. She's currently working on her second book, To Build the World Anew, Black Liberation Politics and the Movement Against the Vietnam War, and a biography of Angela Davis. Justin and Robyn will have a conversation for about 40 minutes and then take questions from our virtual audience. Please click on the question box below to type in your questions, and Robyn will be sure to get to as many as she can. We will try to end this program after 1 hour. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. Justin, congratulations on this formidable achievement. We all know how hard it is to finish a biography. I remember when you were a fellow, sending you off to Paris and North Africa with some trepidation. Some weeks later, I received this email from you. "Fantastic news to report," said Justin. "In Paris, I went to police archives and found a secret file on Cleaver that documented his activities from 1968 to 1979. The big news is that Ahmed Cleaver, his son, agreed to meet with me in Casablanca on April 1st for 4 days. Ahmed was coming from Mecca or Medina, Saudi Arabia. With deep sadness," Justin reported, "I will be forced to stay here in Paris for 10 extra days while I wait for his arrival. My options are to go to Amsterdam or travel around Morocco, writing my 350 words a day from various hotels looking out on the ocean. I'm going to Morocco. I will let you know how things go in Algeria. I am feeling hopeful and adventurous as I head to the African continent tomorrow for the first time in my life. Roman ruins, ancient Muslim temples, and abandoned Black Panther villas await me." So you see, Justin proves that biography can be a very fun adventure. So on that note, I turn it over to Robyn and hope you have a fun conversation with Justin Gifford.
Wonderful. Welcome, everyone, and congratulations, Justin.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Well, Revolution or Death begins with Eldridge Cleaver headed into exile in Cuba. and then it moves into family history, covering enslavement, Jim Crow, and beyond. It ends with his turn to born-again Christianity and eventually his death. In the hundreds of pages in between, the reader learns
Robyn, we're getting a bad echo. Maybe try taking your earbuds out and listening to the computer.
Certainly. Just one moment while I do that.
Try now.
Is this any better?
No, we're still getting an echo. Do you hear the echo, Justin?
I'm not sure if okay, perfect. So I'm just going to continue on with the question, and while Justin answers, I'll edit. So Revolution or Death begins with Cleaver headed into exile in Cuba and moves into his family history, covering enslavement, Jim Crow, and beyond. It ends with his turn to born-again Christianity and eventually his death. What a life journey. In the hundreds of pages in between, the reader learns about Eldridge Cleaver's many iterations, his identity as criminal, Nation of Islam leader, Black Panther, international revolutionary, born-again Christian conservative, to quote your words. Why did you write this book? And what do you want the readers to take away?
Sure, great. Thank you so much for that question. And actually, I just wanted to take a brief moment to thank the Leon Levy Center for having me, especially Kai and Thad for putting this together, and a special thanks to Robyn for putting together these questions on short notice. It's been really great to work with you on this. I'd like to start by just reading a short paragraph from the book before I launch into a discussion of why I came to write it and why I think it's important. This is early on in the book, in the prologue, when Cleaver is just been in a gun battle with Oakland police, and he is escaping to Cuba in 1968, right around Christmas time. There was no going back to America now. Cleaver had started a gunfight with the Oakland police, and he was in open rebellion against the American government. During the decade he had spent in prison, Cleaver had studied a range of thinkers, from political philosophers Thomas Paine and Karl Marx, to radical intellectuals W.E.B. Du Bois and Che Guevara. In fact, one of Cleaver's greatest talents was that he was able to immerse himself in a range of intellectual traditions and adopt different kinds of vocabularies, rhetoric, and ideologies. All of this intensive studying led him to one simple conclusion. The system of capitalism and its agents preyed upon Black people and therefore had to be destroyed. There was no compromise. It was revolution or death. Writing about his final meeting with his parole officer, Cleaver reflected, quote, "I would always think to myself, here is this chump, a descendant of the kidnappers and enslavers of my ancestors, sitting before me, looking into my eyes, trying to show me the point of why I should not be working to smash this evil system. All of that is over. It should be clear now, even to the parole officers, that I repudiate America the ugly in toto, and my every effort is to destroy it so that out of its ashes, America the beautiful can be born." So the question was, why did I write this book? One of the reasons that I wrote this book was because there had never really been a biography written on Eldridge Cleaver before. One scholar had written one in the early 90s, but it was based entirely on published writings and newspaper articles. It wasn't based on any sort of archival work. And I had the good fortune of going to Berkeley's Bancroft Archive Library back in 2015, where a librarian there, Teresa Salazar, who I hope is here tonight, showed me to Cleaver's brand new processed archives, and it included about 35 boxes. And this had everything in it from his unpublished prison novels to the FBI records that were kept on him when he was a Black Panther, to his ill-fated attempt to create men's pants that were called the Cleavers, to his time as a minister as part of the born-again Christian movement. And so I saw this body of work these 35 boxes, and I thought there needs to be some work done on Eldridge Cleaver. No one had done it before, and so that's where I started it. The other reason that I would start it on the archive work on Cleaver and write this book is that Cleaver is a very complicated figure in American history. He's not like a Malcolm X figure or a Martin Luther King figure. He's much more difficult to get a handle on in terms of his trajectory as a radical, as well as his personal life, particularly when it comes to his relationship to women. And a lot of people have steered clear of him because of these things, and it was all the more reason why I wanted to dive in and understand this man and the world that made him.
Thank you. Well, as you mentioned, and as was mentioned in the introduction, writing this book took you around the world. It required you to ferret in attics in the United States, visits to international repositories, as well as oral histories. Talk to us about the archive that you assembled to write this book. What is your favorite story in the making of this book?
Sure, that's a great question. So at the same time that I was working in Berkeley, it took me 2 full summers to read through all of those 35 boxes. At the same time that was happening, I met a woman named Lonnie Kask, who I also hope is here this evening. And Lonnie was a PhD student at Berkeley in the late 90s, and she was related by marriage to Beverly Axelrod, who had been Eldridge Cleaver's lawyer while he was in prison, and then also his fiancée. And she had boxes and boxes of materials, prison records, as well as letters that he wrote while he was in prison, as well as interviews with Axelrod and Eldridge Cleaver himself right at the end of his life. And that really helped round out some of the material in his Berkeley days. Beyond that, I traveled all over the United States and Europe and Africa to find more information on Cleaver. I went to the Arkansas Historical Society, which had the tax records and other documentation of Cleaver's ancestors that went all the way back into slavery, so I was able to recover his slave past. I went to as Kai mentioned earlier, I went to Paris, where I received a special exemption to go through the special police archives there because they had been keeping tabs on him when he was living in Paris in the mid-70s. My favorite story of this was going, of course, to Morocco to meet with Ahmad Cleaver, who is Eldridge Cleaver's son. He met with me there for about a week. We shared an apartment, and we did interviews every single day. And then at the end of that journey together, he actually put me on the phone with his mother, Kathleen Cleaver, who is a revolutionary in her own right. And she invited me to come to her home in Atlanta. So 2 weeks after I came back to the States from Northern Africa, I traveled to Atlanta and spent months in Kathleen's attic going over, gosh, everything you could really imagine. Not only some missing FBI files that weren't in any other place, but also things like letters to former lovers, as well as other unpublished writings that he did at the end of his life. Music videos, all of these things that exist really nowhere. And I got to look at these things right before Kathleen donated them to Emory University, where they're being processed now.
It's really powerful to know that some of those sources are going to be publicly available through Emory. And you also had pretty close contact with the family throughout the writing of much of the work.
The family has been absolutely instrumental in making this book happen. I could not have written the book that I wrote without them. Kathleen in particular, Joju, of course, the daughter, and Maseo were both incredibly helpful with the book, but Kathleen really dedicated a lot of her time. We would sit down together every morning and have breakfast from this place called The Beautiful Restaurant in Atlanta, and it was this amazing soul food restaurant. We'd sit there every day, and she would spend hours just telling me tales of her relationship with Eldridge, from their time together in Berkeley all the way through the end of their relationship in Paris. So the family was really instrumental in the creation of this book.
In many ways, you let Eldridge Cleaver speak for himself. His observations through his journal and other sources are really woven throughout the book. Biographers often develop particular relationships with their subjects. as the process of biography is oftentimes a kind of reincarnation of bringing people back to life in really multidimensional ways. You must feel like you know him. Do you? What challenges did you face in narrating Cleaver's political evolution?
That's a really great question. I mean, what I would say is that, you know, you can know these folks insofar as the archive allows you to know them, right? So whatever documents are available, whatever interviews you're able to do with family and friends, the picture that you get is the picture that is available through those texts. And luckily, I was really blessed to be able to go to, I think, about 12 different archives in order to get this like very holistic picture of his life. I think that one of the challenges with Cleaver in particular is that many people want to stop talking about his life once the 1960s ends. They want to think about him as this kind of fire-breathing black radical of the revolutionary moment, but they don't really want to think about the complicated contradictions that occur later, like when he comes back to the United States and becomes part of the born-again Christian movement and becomes a Christian preacher, which really flies in the face of his more kind of like radical identity. And so for me, the challenge of this book was figuring out a way of understanding and narrating all of the parts of his life as representative of the moment that he comes from, and not just the Black Panther moment, but think about these other moments as well as constitutive of his identity and also a reflection of the kinds of racism that he was facing throughout his life.
Throughout the book.
Sorry, can you say that again?
Violence runs throughout the book. From the violence of his family life as a child, to the violence of Jim Crow Arkansas, to the violence of the many, many institutions of correction that he passed through, where he encountered gang culture that shaped him, to the violence of his predatory attitudes towards women that led to repeated rapes and repeated abuse in his volatile marriage. How do you move us through that violence, right? It really permeates the book in very, very real ways. It makes the book a chilling read. What do you want readers to take away about the nexus between radical politics, interpersonal violence, and state violence as represented through the life of Eldridge Cleaver?
Yeah, great. I think that's such an amazing question. One of the things that the book really tries to do is to connect Cleaver's personal acts of violence, his rapes when he was younger, his violence towards fellow Black Panther members at certain points of his life, his violence toward white people in general. I want to connect those all to historic acts of violence, because what I see, the reason why I tell this story as going all the way back to slavery is that Cleaver's individual acts of violence cannot be understood outside of the context of America's systematic violence. And that those individual acts of violence that he commits are themselves both expressions of the larger traumas that he experiences throughout his life, but it's also an indictment of that violence that he experiences. Not everyone can end up like Martin Luther King, right? Some people experience the perverse violence of slavery and Jim Crow and the prison industrial complex, and they come out like Eldridge Cleaver. And so I see his violence as an extension of these larger systems of violence that he lives through, and also an indictment of those same systems.
Well, Eldridge Cleaver's nickname was Papa Rage, and your book certainly gets to the many sources of rage and anger, from his upbringing to his internal rage to the righteous anger at the ravages of racism in the US. Joy, however, is fleeting. There's a lovely description of a boyish Cleaver on his grandfather's farm, where you say, well, he says, those were the days of kissing the earth, of touching and smelling wild things growing. Love and tenderness are harder to tease out. I want to ask about the absence of more of these moments in Cleaver's story, not as an issue of archive or historical context, but perhaps a portal into a particular type of manhood narrative that his life represented at the time.
Yeah, that's really great. I mean, one of the things that's clear from, the 5 years of research that I did on Cleaver was that there are not a lot of moments of tenderness, as you say. They are few far between in the text. You get them with his relationship to his lawyer, actually, Beverly Axelrod. He has 2,000 pages of letters that are at the Berkeley Bancroft that you can look through, and they develop quite an intimate relationship over the course of a few years. His relationship to Kathleen is also very tender, and particularly in the beginning of the relationship when they're starting off as Black Panthers together. It's clear that they are revolutionaries in love, and there is a tenderness there. The only other place that I witnessed tenderness in his writings or in the way that people talked about him was his relationship with his children. He always had a soft spot for kids, and it's clear from my interviews with both Ahmad and with Joju that he was deeply loving with them, and the book talks about some of this. However, as you so rightly point out, Robyn, the majority of the work is about a certain kind of self-presentation that is invested in a specific type of masculinity, is a very inflexible, cold, violent masculinity. And I think in part that's because Cleaver himself was ideologically committed to this kind of identity. He was at his core a hardcore Marxist and believed that the revolutionary was a doomed man and could not have any sort of filial relationships or friends or any kind of comforts in life, because his sole purpose in life was to bring about the revolution. And I think that he lived through that ideology in every aspect of his life, even when he wasn't with the Black Panther Party anymore. That was still a through line that really determined his whole life.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that response. I mean, his life sort of represents how deeply political and personal, the personal being political, was so intertwined in that moment. And I think that the enduring space that he holds in the public imagination is something to critically interrogate, given what we know now, finally with some footnotes behind it, to be the reality of his past.
Yeah.
Well, this book unfolds in many different geographies. We go from Cuba. We're teased with Cuba in the introduction. We get Cuba in a full chapter later on. We get Algeria, North Korea, the Congo, Paris. It seems to suggest that for students of this era, the Black Revolution was constituted in a variety of different spaces. Can you trace Cleaver as a thinker and how his political commitments were reflected by his movements throughout these global radical networks?
Great. Yeah, excellent question. So, I mean, Cleaver's this really interesting case where he commits a bunch of petty crimes when he's in his teens. He gets put away for selling marijuana when he's, I think, 18 years old. When he enters prison for the first time, he meets a convict who says, "You need to get your stuff together, read this book," and he hands him a copy of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. So right from that moment, Cleaver becomes a dedicated organic intellectual. He reads everything he can get his hands on in terms of Western philosophy. So he's reading Marx, he's reading Kant, he's reading Machiavelli. And then he starts to also read Black radical thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois and Frantz Fanon. And throughout about a decade-long period in prison, he really immerses himself in a variety of like radical critical traditions, kind of European and African American. When he meets Bobby Seale and Huey Newton as the Panthers, they think along similar lines that he does, which is that Frantz Fanon is an inspiration in that they think of Black America as a colony, as an internal colony that needs to expunge the occupying police force. And so rather than thinking in terms of assimilationist terms, Cleaver and Newton and Seale are all thinking about trying to expel the police from Black communities. This kind of thinking follows him wherever he goes. Once he gets into a shootout with the Oakland police and escapes the United States, he first goes to Cuba, where he thinks that Castro is going to give him a training facility where he will be able to train Black Panthers in guerrilla warfare and then send them back to the United States, where they will basically launch an assault on the police forces there. He eventually gets kicked out of Cuba for reasons that you can read in my book. He ends up in Algeria at that point, and at that point he's supported by the Algerian government. They give him a villa along with a number of other Panthers and $500 a month stipend, and their job is to create an international coalition of Black Panthers. At the same time, he's also traveling to China, to North Korea, and to Vietnam, and he's trying to build alliances, kind of an international alliance between the concerns of Black people in America who are struggling for their freedom and the larger struggles of anti-colonial freedom around the globe. So Cleaver, from the time he got into prison to the time that he leaves Algeria in 1975, constantly is developing a global perspective about Black people's place in a larger struggle for freedom.
Definitely. And I definitely appreciated the conversation about Kathleen Cleaver's role in Algeria in doing and creating an organizational framework that really allowed for the space to thrive as a political space, and also as a space of living and community as well.
Kathleen Cleaver is in many ways the unsung hero of this book. Because I was able to look at all those archives about Eldridge Cleaver, I also had the opportunity to see what Kathleen Cleaver had been doing at the same time. And, thankfully I was able to bring in a lot of information that showed that, she is one of the organizing heads of the International Panther Party, which is something that she hasn't really gotten credit for in the past. And I think it's really important to see just like how instrumental she was also in this international effort.
Definitely, definitely. And you also mentioned Cleaver's movement through so many correctional institutions, and we'll put correctional in quotations, but there's really, I think, a pace in the middle of the book where you see him going from institution to institution, which is really intriguing to read. And I think it will dovetail nicely with all of the carceral studies and the study of the prison industrial complex that are that are coming out apace today. Well, Eldridge Cleaver is inextricably tied to his role as the leader of the Black Panther Party in the popular imagination. That might be the only thing that many people know about him. And the Panthers, an organization, despite the thick scholarship in many documentaries and an increasing number of popular films, they remain inextricably tied to this kind of violent narrative. The other reality is that there's a great man theory of history, which uses the history of men to stand in for the history of organizations, for the history of movements, for a far more complex and complicated reality. What do you say to people who will want to make this book about Eldridge Cleaver, especially one that is so centered on violence, and make that into the history of the Black Panther Party? And in fact, they may see everything before and after that as prelude and postscript. Important to note that he doesn't even get to the Black Panther Party until we're over 100 pages into the book, right? But for many people, this is what they will maybe pick up this book for and think it's about. What would you say to them?
Yeah, great question. I think that, the impulse to try to recuperate Cleaver as Black Panther, or to think primarily in terms of the Black Panther history, is totally understandable. Because I think that the question that people are asking is, what out of that radical revolutionary history can be recuperated for our own moment, right? That we're in now, that we're experiencing now. And so we're looking to the Panthers as a kind of precursor in some ways to Black Lives Matter. However, what is also the case is that when Cleaver and when Cleaver and Huey Newton got together and started recruiting for the Panthers, they did so by doing these armed patrols. They were openly brandishing shotguns and other weapons and carrying law books, and they would go around and listening to police scanners, and they would find places where white cops were arresting Black people, and they would stand at a safe distance away, holding their guns and reading from the penal code about what is to be done so that the arrests were done properly. Using the gun as a recruitment tool was what made the Panthers incredibly popular at the beginning. But as soon as the Mulford Act was passed, which prohibited this kind of open display of weapons in urban areas, and as soon as the FBI started to investigate Cleaver and the Panthers had to shift their tactics to be able to combat racism. And so what I would say to those people that want to only kind of fetishize the Black Panther moment is that the Black Panther moment is only one moment in history that required certain kinds of tactics to engage with and counter racism. We have to understand the changing conditions on the ground in order to understand what kinds of decisions that Cleaver made in combating that racism. And so for me, I'm really interested in understanding all of the parts of Cleaver's story because they're each reflective of a very specific kind of moment in America's history of racism. And I think we can learn from Cleaver to see, how we might confront and even combat that to some degree.
Definitely. And I wanted to highlight there just your discussion of his family background, in particular, just the role of education, his mother's commitment to education, how reading was seen and education was seen as a way out of really challenging economic conditions that African Americans faced at this time. So definitely, I think you can read this book for many different insights into this particular time period.
There's a way in which the book is in some ways, for all of its like unconventional things in it, there is something deeply conventional about this story of like literacy equals freedom. Mm-hmm. And that is a core part of this story, not only in terms of the way that Cleaver's mother raised the children, but then also Cleaver's own self-education in prison, and then his later self-education once he's out of prison and trying to transform himself into a public figure in the 70s and then the 80s.
Definitely. Well, Revolution or Death joins a growing list of biographies of Black life in the late 20th century. It's more than the story of a life, but also a portal into dramatic, exciting, and often heartbreaking political times. This book is born in 2020, a year that many have seen as a tipping point. 2020 will go down in history. It's born into an America in the grips of twin pandemic, of the coronavirus, and state violence. Every day seems to bring more and more evidence of the abject disregard of Black life. Black resistance is on an upsurge, as is religious conservatism. And the 60s, 70s, and 80s seem to be on endless loop as people are looking back into those earlier times for answers and for models for a way forward today. What does this book offer to readers at this particular moment in history?
Great. I'm going to kind of refer to my notes here as I talk this through because I wanted to make sure that I really addressed this most important question directly. I mean, one of the things I think that the book offers is looking at the ways in which the racial issues that we face now, police brutality, white indifference to Black suffering, that those have a direct line all the way back to slavery, through Jim Crow, prison industrial complex, 1960s into now. So that the book is basically using Cleaver as a vehicle to show the continuity of this kind of Black oppression that Cleaver is trying to, through his whole life, fight. The second thing that I would say that the book offers is that Cleaver's most kind of important and radical critiques of America, his critique of capitalism, his critique of American imperialism, his critique of American cities turning Black neighborhoods into Black colonies that are occupied by the police. Mm-hmm. These critiques are just as important now as they were in 1968 when he first started talking about them. And I think that whatever we may make of Cleaver's personal life and his personal choices, his larger criticisms that he unleashes in that moment are as significant now as they were 50 years ago. And then the last thing I'll say is that, Cleaver makes this turn to the right when he comes back from Paris and Algeria, and it shocks a lot of people. And in fact, this is one of the reasons that people don't talk about Eldridge Cleaver too much, is because he becomes a Christian conservative and inexplicably seems to turn his back on all of the radical ideals that he had formulated in the 1960s. And I can't help but think about Ice Cube right now and 50 Cent and Kanye, and how a lot of people are also looking at them and saying, how can you turn to the right in this moment of Trump? And what I think is something interesting about Cleaver as an example is that maybe this turn is not so much a story about the individual failure of these people to stay with radical politics, but maybe what it expresses is the failure of the left to account for and speak to the experiences of Black men. And I think that there's more work to be done on this question, and I've only started thinking about it in the last couple of days as these stories have been coming out. But some of the same backlash that we're seeing against Ice Cube and others sounds a lot like the same backlash that Cleaver got when he made his rightward turn. So embracing these contradictions and holding these different ideas in our heads at the same time, this is what I want people to be able to do when they read this book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Before I open up to questions from the audience, I want to encourage everyone to write your question into the Ask a Question box. Let me ask you, Justin, did you feel like you saw seeds of who Eldridge Cleaver became at the end in his upbringing, in his childhood, or anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, particularly his relationship with his father seemed paramount in shaping the person that he was, because in many of his personal writings that were unpublished and stored in these libraries, he would tell these stories of this violence that his father would enact upon the family. I mean, at one point he took an axe and just smashed up all of the pictures in the house and all of their possessions. And I couldn't help but think that sounds a lot like Eldridge Cleaver in his actions later. So I think that much of the things that you see in terms of his relationship with his family get reproduced in his life later. And then the other thing that I would say is that, you know, there's a heavy utopian impulse in all of Cleaver's writings and his desires. Like from the time that he enters prison to the time that he leaves the Black Panthers and later, he wants a utopia. He wants us to be free of racial strife, class strife, and that utopian thinking is deeply ingrained in his early writings, particularly that passage that you read about his grandfather's farm. He really believed that a utopia could exist, if not necessarily achievable, something to be sought after.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you so much for your comments and for this work. I want to turn to some of the questions in the Q&A box. Some are more coming in, but I want to start with the first one there now. And I'm going to embellish it a little bit from my side. So the question is, to what extent did being white, to what extent did your racial identity, let's say being white, was a barrier to writing this biography? And I also want to, from my side, I want to ask, well, did being white open doors or result in a type of access that sort of ameliorated that? How did you negotiate your racial identity in doing this work, both positive and negative?
That's great. That's a great question. And it's a thing that I think about every single day since I started doing this work 20 years ago is, you know, I'm an African-American studies person. That's what I got my PhD in. That's what I've written my first 3 books about. So I'm constantly thinking about this question of, you know, what does my whiteness mean with relationship to these projects and my relationships with people and how I work with people. And one of the things that I'll say that it certainly, I wouldn't say even hinders, but it offers some challenges, is that sometimes when I contact people and I tell them that I'm working on this project on Eldridge Cleaver, there is some, by certain Black audiences, some healthy suspicion of the fact that I'm a white guy doing this work. And that's a suspicion that I think is historically based. It's a suspicion that I think is socially and culturally based. And it's something that I actually both expect and invite, because then it offers an opportunity to have a conversation with that person about, like, what are my interests, what are my goals, and what are my agendas here? And it's through a conversation about agenda that I can then get to the real crux of the matter, which is that for me, this is a question about class. And a question about how class and race and gender and sexuality intersect in these narratives. In this case, Eldridge Cleaver's narrative, but in a broader sense, America's narratives about kind of like racial identity and racial formation and class identity and class formation. So in this way, I've been really fortunate that the people that I've worked with the most, people like Kathleen Cleaver, they don't really care about my race. Once we got past the initial conversations about those things, we set to work on the work. And the work was about going through the archive and reading the texts and understanding the materials that are available. And so I feel like what is important for me is to keep my racial identity at the center of the conversation when we're establishing the kind of like groundwork of the project, but then to do the work that I'm trained to do, which is to go into archives, to read and to write arguments and narratives based on this historical research that I've found. So I would say it both is and isn't an important part of the work. And trying to keep a delicate balance of the two is what I'm always trying to achieve.
Wonderful. And I'm going to merge this next question together, but someone wanted to know about you as a teacher, right? So you just talked about the research. How has your research and methods of investigation translated, if at all, to your work as a college professor?
Great. Thanks so much for asking that. I actually invited a number of my students today to the talk, so I'm hoping that some of them are actually out there and can hear this. But my research really does inform my teaching. I'm teaching, for instance, a core humanities course right now, and that's basically an American history course from Christopher Columbus to the present. And this week we were doing Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs and looking at the slave narrative. And you know, one of the things that characterizes the slave narrative is that it's a realist genre. It is a genre that is about putting on display Black suffering under the regime of a slave system. And that links directly to what I'm doing with Eldridge Cleaver's work and showing Eldridge Cleaver's life and what decisions he made based on the kinds of racial oppression that he faced. So what I'm constantly trying to do in my classes, even the ones that are these kind of like large lectures with 180 people in them, is to say to my students, look, the stuff that you are reading today is energized by this whole background of research that you may not know anything about, and that the two are intimately connected. We as researchers go off and spend our summers and our vacations in libraries so that we can bring that information back and present it to you all in the classroom. So I see those two things as intimately tied, and I really try to, as much as possible, bring those two worlds together. The other, just the other thing that I'll just say is I also teach at the Northern Nevada Correctional Center, which is a prison just about 25 miles outside of Reno. And that's another situation where my research and my teaching inform one another. My first book, Street Poison, was a biography of a guy named Iceberg Slim, who was a former pimp who became a writer. And this is a very popular book in prisons. And so I will often teach that book to my undergraduates as well as my inmates. And then I will bring the undergraduates to the prison, and we have a big group discussion about the whole thing. So I really see these worlds of academia and then undergraduate life and the prison as spaces that need to be brought together in conversations.
We've got a couple of questions about the religious shift. So did Cleaver himself ever talk about his shift from left to right, from Marxist to born again? And did he truly abandon the revolutionary spirit as part of this evolution or part of this turn? Is there any evidence that he had plans to continue the revolution? Great.
Wonderful question. I don't want to give everything away because there's some big reveals in the book, but I mean, I will tell you this. One of the things that Kathleen Cleaver graciously let me do was she had written a number of letters to Eldridge that were sealed and put in the archive at Berkeley, not to be opened until 2025, so 5 more years from now. But she let me look at them first. And what was in there were all of the letters that he wrote to a friend once he came back to America, explaining why he decided to become a preacher. And what became clear from those letters is that he didn't feel that he had any other choice. At that point, the Black Panthers had totally disavowed him. People on the left had totally disavowed him. The only people that were willing to pay his legal fees were born-again Christians. And so he decided to become a preacher because they were paying the bills. However, he went on the road and started going around preaching at all of these different colleges and schools and churches. And at the same time he was doing that, he was meeting with the remaining Black Panthers that had gone underground in order to try to create a whole new underground system of the Black Panther Party in the late 1970s, early 1980s. So he was doing both at the same time. He was at once launching this career as a born-again Christian to try to pay the bills, and then at the same time he was secretly meeting with these quote-unquote underground brothers, as he used to call them, in order to try to create a whole new revolution.
Wonderful. I want to say that your students are here and they want to send you all of their love and support from the comment box. Some questions about Kathleen Cleaver. Any possibility of you pursuing a project on Kathleen Cleaver herself is one of them. And then the other question is, tell us more about Kathleen, who seems to come off as an admirable story. What happened to their marriage? What was the breaking point? What can you tell us that will also encourage us to go out and purchase the book to get the end story?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Kathleen is just she's wonderful in so many ways. I owe her so much. I can't say enough good things about Kathleen Cleaver. When I asked her if she wanted to have a biography of her written, she said, in unqualified way, no, I don't. I don't want a biography written about me. She said, or at least wait till I'm dead. But don't. She's very. She lacks an ego in this way. That she didn't want to make it about her. And this, of course, is all the more reason to tell her story because it's so phenomenal in so many ways. Their marriage was a rocky one. Eldridge was very abusive, physically and emotionally abusive. He was also wrapped up in the revolution when they were living overseas, and so he was just really not there for that marriage. And Kathleen stuck by him all through the time that they were abroad. She stuck by him when they came back to the States and he was in prison and they were fighting his court case against the Oakland police. And then finally in 1980, after he was clear of all charges and freed, that's when she took the kids and left and went to Yale, finished her undergraduate degree and then finished her law degree and then became a really well-recognized lawyer after that. So Kathleen's story is itself an amazing tale, and if not myself, then someone needs to tell this story. And once her papers come available at Emory, which my sense of it is that they take a couple of years to be processed, but once those are available, that will be an incredible resource for anybody who wants to do a project on her, myself or someone else.
Definitely. There are a few questions that want you to clarify or speak to class in the left. So what did you mean, or can you go deeper when you said that it's a failure of the left to speak to Black men? Do you mean that the left is not an ideal party for these people, or did you mean something else? Is there a way to fix the left, quote unquote, to pertain to more of these folks?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm hesitant to speak on the contemporary political landscape because it just seems so totally chaotic at the moment. But what I will say, what I can talk about is a little bit of Cleaver's own logic. And what was interesting about Cleaver is that at the time when he was a Panther, you had various kinds of competing Black radical groups, and the Panthers was just one of them. And you also had SNCC and SNCC, which was led by Stokely Carmichael, and it was primarily a Black nationalist group. So they weren't really interested in creating alliances with whites. And Cleaver thought this was a huge mistake. He felt that the only real revolution could happen with an alliance between Black radicals and white radicals. And so he built all sorts of connections between the Peace and Freedom Party, which was an anti-war party, and actually he ran for president under that party, president of the United States in 1968. So for Cleaver, there was an imperative to bring together Black working class and white working class people in a way that he didn't feel that other organizations were doing. And so I think his turn later to the right was basically facing a situation where he didn't feel like the alliance that he had been hoping for between the black left and the white left had occurred, and so he felt like, I'm just going to abandon this whole thing because it's not suiting my political views, my political interests. There's much more to be said on this. I think it's left better to contemporary scholars to hash that out. But that's what I know about Cleaver's own trajectory politically.
We have a question about your source base. Can you tell us something about what you found in those FBI files? And I'll add to that those police records that you were digging in Paris. Are there any tidbits that you can offer out? And even just suggestions for methodologies in dealing with the type of materials that come through these suspicious and malicious sources.
Yeah. There's one. So one of the things I'll talk about is the FBI files. Now, some of you already probably know that the FBI was keeping tabs on like a wide range of black leaders and thinkers in the late 60s, including Martin Luther King and James Baldwin and Ralph Ellison and Eldridge Cleaver. And in those documentations, we have, a very damning insight into the degree to which the FBI was trying to sabotage the Black Panthers. And one of the things that I found in one of the reports was that Cleaver had been accused of rape in Cuba. But there was no other documentation anywhere in anything that I'd come across to back this up. And so because of my knowledge of the FBI being pretty shady about the ways in which that it represented the black men that it was surveying, they said similar things about Martin Luther King. I had to judge that as not reliable evidence, even as I was looking at all the ways in which Cleaver was acting in other, disturbing ways throughout his life. So going through these FBI files, I had to use them as kind of historical evidence to reconstruct what was happening with Cleaver, but then also bring a certain amount of critical doubt to what they were saying, because they were themselves a racist institution and not entirely dependable in the way that they were representing these facts. So, for those researchers out there who are looking to do work like this, what I would tell you is that you just want to bring a certain kind of healthy skepticism whenever you encounter anything, especially by the FBI in the 1960s talking about black people. You can be sure that it is influenced by and informed by a racist outlook that does in some ways constitute the very content of those documents.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I had an additional question before I shift back to the comment box. I think it sort of dovetails off of what you were saying. It seems to me that the sexual violence that sort of permeates and is a through line in Cleaver's life. It seems to me that your book really centralizes it in ways that are very, very important. Because one of the reasons why I think that Cleaver is not more part of the 60s narrative is because of those realities.
Yeah.
Soul on Ice, once you read it, I think especially in the context of this particular moment in 2020 with Me Too and all of this awareness of sexual violence, the trigger warnings upon reading that book would be, off the chain.
Yeah.
So can you speak to sort of Cleaver's ability to, in some way, transcend that storyline, which might have seemed like it would have led to a cancellation or at least a sense of like a period after his name in terms of defining him more? Why is it that he is a rapist and but?
Yeah.
And there are many other conversations to have. Why isn't there much more of a hover over those facts in his life? And I don't mean I'm not referring to your book in general, but even just his general reception.
Yeah.
Like, I think your book provides the evidence that was needed to really bring these things together.
I think you're asking the crux of you're getting to the crux of the problem of why Cleaver has not been talked about until this point. It's because his sexual politics is so abhorrent. They're so abhorrent that it's difficult to recuperate him when faced with these like very real and raw descriptions from his own pen of the sexual violence that he committed against women. What I want to do in my book, and what I hope that I've been able to do in the book, is to say those individual acts of violence are not to be understood in isolation, but in terms of a larger context of American racism and violence. So in the chapter where I write about Cleaver's rapes, and this is a part of the book where he describes in gratuitous detail and calculating chilling detail how he would go out and find white couples that he would rape the woman and beat up the man. He did this because, as I say in my book, when he was in prison, he got news of Emmett Till's lynching, and he started to read about the history of lynching in this country. And what he realized was that the biggest massacres in American history against black people often were because a black man had been accused of flirting with or raping or in some other way offending a white woman. And like in the Tulsa riots, for instance. And he was so enraged with this reality that he read Richard Wright's Native Son and decided, I am going to become the very symbol of violence and hate that America thinks that we all are. And I'm going to embody that, that violent figure as a response to a history of violence against black men. So in his perverse logic, he's doing something political. He's doing something rational. And I think to just say, well, Cleaver was a rapist and then dismiss him is really short-sighted, because what those moments of sexual violence make us have to look at, I think, is our systematic history of sexual violence as it pertains to black people more broadly, and that Cleaver's response is just one individual response to a larger systematic problem.
Definitely. I think that there was something also very powerful in just spooling out his childhood and the environment that he grew up in, to kind of think about this, again, this sort of through line of violence and how it operates.
Yeah.
So more comments in the chat. People congratulating you, saying that you're doing an excellent job with the questions. Happy that you were able to bring the family in and have access to so many papers in so many different places as well. So before we log off, I just want to give you an opportunity to tell people where they can go to pick up the book.
Yeah, great. You can find it where basically all books are sold. Amazon's a good place to go to find it. You can, if you leave a review for me on Amazon, it helps me a lot. I guess if you get 10 reviews on Amazon, it bumps your promotion up a level. So I would love if people could go buy the book and leave a review.
Wonderful. And of course, the publisher is Lawrence Hill, right?
Yep.
Lawrence Hill Books. So that's another option as well. I want to thank you so much, Justin, for the time. I want to thank the Levi Center for Biography for the space to have this conversation, and thank everyone in the audience for engaging and asking such intriguing questions. I'm excited that there are over 220 people who logged in to hear this conversation about Black radical politics. So thank you very much.
Thanks. And let me just say two quick things. One, if you haven't read Robyn Spencer's book, The Revolution Has Come, you should absolutely check it out. It is a brilliant history of the Black Panther Party, particularly around the issues of gender. And I just want to dedicate today to the memory of Ahmad Cleaver. He died a few months after I met him of a heart condition. And so I was one of the last people that he got to talk to before he passed away. And so I feel really honored. I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for him. So I just want to give him a shout out.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. All right, everyone. Thank you. Really appreciate the support.